This podcast is brought to you by ProLongevity, the award-winning 8-week program that transforms the lives of people with diabetes, pre-diabetes and many other illnesses. Founded by me, Graham Phillips, the pharmacist who gave up drugs.
So, welcome everyone to another edition of the ProLongevity podcast. My guest today is Dr Malcolm Kendrick, GP extraordinaire, has a fascinating insight into the whole cardiovascular area, has written numerous books, one of which, Doctoring Data, Malcolm, I found fascinating. I was going to cover it with you today, but actually so important that I'd like to preempt the discussion by inviting you back on another occasion to discuss that. I've learned there are certain people who are icons for me and for whom I've learned a tremendous amount on my own health and advisory journey. And Malcolm's latest book, The Plot Thickens, otherwise known as The Clot Thickens, aptly named, and it describes the whole way that cardiovascular damage develops, heart attacks and strokes and so on and so forth. And without spoiler alert, Malcolm, I just, as I said to you earlier on, I think it's an area that I've struggled with for many, many years, and I've read an awful lot on this subject. And it's not, an area I learned a lot when I was at university, but I learned the fundamental science. And for the first time ever, I think I've got a proper grasp of this subject, and that's entirely down to you. So thank you for your time. Thank you for this wonderful book. Everyone should read it. Now, this is an area that's incredibly complex. And I'm sure even in your book, you don't deal with all the biomolecular complexity. And I listened to a wonderful podcast with you recently on Nourish, Balance, Thrive. And they do go into the complexity. So my aim today is to kind of bridge between the understanding of an interested lay individual and the more complex area that you covered in Nourish, Balance, Thrive, and we'll link to that in the show notes. But I thought we'd kind of go through a few myths and then at the end maybe look at what we could do. So kind of brings me to my first question, which is cholesterol. Because we hear about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, and as you so beautifully explain in the book, medical terminology is both confused and confusing. And I want to start off by not making the mistake of discussing good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, because neither of those things exist. There's just cholesterol. And say, number one, what is cholesterol? And number two, why is it of such fundamental importance? And let's lay this myth to bed right at the start.
Right. Well, it does, as everyone finds, it gets complicated. Cholesterol is just a chemical. It has a formula, something like C27H46O16 or something like that. For reasons that are inexplicable, we decided to call something else that we measure in the bloodstream cholesterol, and that is a lipoprotein. Now, lipoproteins are, if you like, the taxis that move cholesterol around inside your body. So they're made in the liver primarily, and then as they move around the body, they lose fats or fatty acids, and then they contain considerably more cholesterol. So there is no such thing as cholesterol in your bloodstream. It doesn't exist. There are these little taxis, little spheres that carry it around. The reason for this is that cholesterol is not soluble in water and therefore wouldn't be soluble in blood. So it would just clump together in big clumps wherever it went. So it has to be protected from water. Otherwise, we'd have a nightmare on your hands. So people decided to call a substance in your blood that isn't cholesterol, and from then on, no one's understood what anyone's talking about.
So let's just talk about what cholesterol is and what it does and why it's a fundamental. I mean, if you have no cholesterol, it's incompatible with life, just like not having oxygen. And yet, if you kind of get the drift from the medical orthodoxy, the less cholesterol, the better. And that's absolutely untrue. So let's just say a little bit about what cholesterol does in the body and why it's of fundamental importance to life.
Well, cholesterol is a substance that's found one thing I sometimes say to people is, why do you think an egg yolk has got so much cholesterol in it? And I said it's because it takes an awful lot of cholesterol to build a healthy chicken. As it requires an awful lot of healthy of cholesterol to build a healthy human being. It's really one of the most fundamental molecules we have. It's part of our, what they call the cell membranes. Animals have cell membranes and plants have cell walls. Our cell membranes have cholesterol within them, if you like, to help to form all sorts of critical, what they call rafts, that allow the transfer of molecules in and out of cells. It also maintains the structure of the cell membrane. Without cholesterol, the cell membrane would disintegrate and all your cells would disintegrate and you would be instantly dead. Another thing, that the basic cholesterol is a building block for an awful lot of hormones in your body. So things like cortisol, and vitamin D is actually the basic structure of vitamin D is cholesterol, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, adrenaline. These hormones are all based on the cholesterol molecule with different attachments to one side or the other. And the other couple of things that cholesterol is hugely important for, within the brain, your synapses are really almost pure cholesterol. So your synapses are things that the communication gaps between neurons are cholesterol rich, and the sheaths that surround your neurons, the myelin sheaths, are very high in cholesterol. And in fact, in the brain, because the lipoprotein that carries cholesterol can't actually get into your brain, the brain has to synthesize its own cholesterol in order to meet its needs. So 25% of the dry weight of your brain, for example, is cholesterol. So that just gives you some examples of how critical it is.
So I hope, even if some of that's a bit technical for the listener or the viewer, the point here is that the cholesterol molecule is fundamental to life. It's so important that I think the majority of the cells in the body can make cholesterol. And this idea that there's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol is ridiculous, because there's only one version of cholesterol. It's, as you said, it's the basis of our brain, the basis of our hormones. It's in every cell membrane. And just logically, why would 2 million years of evolution go to the trouble of producing something like this that was bad for us? So I think that's myth number one laid to rest, if you like. And I'd like to pause here slightly and ask a little bit about you, because you've got this incredible expertise around cardiovascular disease, but you've got a day job too as a GP. So tell us a little bit about your GP practice, and where the kind of area that you serve and what your patients look like.
Well, at the moment, I'm no longer a partner in general practice. I work in what they call intermediate care primarily, which is dealing with elderly people who've had a crisis in their existence, fallen and broken a leg or had an acute infection. And what we're trying to do is get them back on their feet and get them back into the community. That's my main day job. I also work in what we call antivirus, seeing people as semi or emergencies in the antivirus system. And I do some locum general practice, but I'm not a partner in a general practice currently. And increasingly, very few GPs see that as a long-term role at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a whole other discussion. As you know, my partner is in life is a GP, and she's just handed a notice in for probably the same kind of pressures. But you were a partner in a GP practice?
I was a couple of times in Scotland, and then down in Cambridge for a while. I've had a bit more of a kind of portfolio life of working than I suppose a number of doctors have. I think I like to see myself as a trailblazer, a trendsetter, because nowadays more and more people are saying, well, they're doing other things other than just straightforward going into the same surgery for the rest of their lives work. So it's and I think it is something that's where general practice is going to be, with people doing different roles, here and there, if you like, rather than just the one job. That's sort of how things seem to be going.
But your level of knowledge and expertise in this area, and also the level of controversy that you're prepared to broach, is not that of a typical GP. So what was your critical path, if you like, that led you from what many would see the GP as doing, as following nice guidelines and protocols, exercising the prescription pad and handing out statins, to a somewhat contrarian view of that?
Well, I think it was a gradual process. I mean, when you're at medical school, you just absorb all these millions of facts they throw at you with no real criticism, if you like. Yeah, because that you won't pass your exams if you do that.
Yeah.
But I was in Scotland in medical school at that time. Scotland had the highest rate of heart disease in the world, probably. Although
I think it still glories in that statistic. It's all those tried Mars bars, right?
Well, not anymore. The countries that have the highest rates. The country with the highest rate of heart disease currently, I believe, is Turkmenistan.
Oh, right. Only you would know that.
If you want to or not. In fact, almost all ex-Soviet Union countries are in the top of the pops.
Yeah.
The rate of heart disease in Scotland under the age of 65 is about a fifth of what it was in the 1980s. Of course, that's interesting in and of itself, but I was interested, why are we in Scotland dying? We were all told the same thing: our diet's terrible, and that raises our cholesterol level, and we all die of heart disease. I happened to have been to France several times, and I went to France and I noticed that the French eat more saturated fat or fats than we did. So I started looking at it and thinking, well, the diet part of the diet heart hypothesis doesn't seem to be making sense. And then I looked at the other factors that they consider important, like blood pressure, cholesterol levels, how much animal fat, saturated fat, how many people have got diabetes, etc., and matched up I couldn't match up the Scotsmen exactly. It was British men to French, because some of the statistics are not available.
Yeah.
And really, as I like to joke, you couldn't get a cigarette paper between them. And in fact, found that the French smoked more, for example, apparently took less exercise,
drank more.
So actually, the risk factors favoured Scotland over France, or Britain over France, and yet the French rate of heart disease was 1/5 that of Scotland.
Yeah.
So, when you come across facts like this, you either go, oh, well, that's just some form of weird.
Well, it was known as the French paradox. The explanation I always give, it's the French paradox. Maybe it's the red wine. That's what I was told.
Yeah, we were all told it was the red wine. And of course, the thing is, whenever you get a paradox means, I think I looked it up one time, a finding which appears contradictory, but actually can be explained through other mechanisms.
Yeah.
So just by calling it a paradox, what you're basically saying is, well, okay, there's obviously some reason for this, and anyone was very happy to find those reasons. If you look at the red wine explanation, it just doesn't work. And in fact, some of the original research that was done on reversitrol, or whatever it's called, was actually found to be falsified anyway.
Yeah.
The red wine thing is just, it's what I call ad hoc hypothesis. If you find a contradictory fact, what people have a tendency to do is say, oh, well, why is it contradictory? Oh, here's the explanation.
Yeah.
And then they then go, oh, well, we've now explained that. The French don't get much heart disease. Actually, the explanation I got was they drink red wine, they eat lightly cooked vegetables, which protects the antioxidants. And what was the other one? And they did something else as well. But I mean, once you started chasing them down, they all found to just be something somebody said. A bloke down the pub said it. Yeah. Which is the same way as you possibly know the 5 portions of fruit and vegetables are protective. And then you try and find out where that research came from. And it came from nowhere.
It came from vegetable, like fibre day. It came from the people who want to sell you the stuff. Just like 10,000 steps, got no basis except for the bloke who wants to sell you a pedometer. Yeah. It's myths. Yeah.
Well, it's just myths, and you chase them down. And then there's all this, why do women get less heart disease than men when they tend to have higher cholesterol levels? Yeah. Or low density lipoprotein levels, and then they said, oh, they're protected by their female sex hormones.
Yeah.
And then when you chase that down, you find there is absolutely no evidence for this whatsoever. There is just, in fact, the evidence such as there is would suggest that female sex hormones are mildly causative of cardiovascular disease. And yet these things then just hang. Why do women generally get about 1/3 the rate of heart disease of men at the same age? Well, if you look at the risk factors, there's no explanation for this, but no one seems to be interested in once someone said, oh, what's the sex hormones? Everyone goes, oh, it's the sex hormones, and you'll see that written down. And even when it was disproved, it's still written down.
It is extraordinary, isn't it? Because we're all taught the fundamentals of science, and yet there are certain things that you dare not question. It's like gravity, right? No one in the right mind would question the existence of gravity. It just is.
Yeah.
And this whole, and let's, you mentioned the diet heart hypothesis. Just say a bit more about that.
Well, it started life. It started life quite a long time ago, but it kind of flamed into pure life in about the late 1940s, early 1950s. Was one researcher called Ansel Keys from America, the inventor of a thing called K rations, which you might have heard of. He's a very bright guy, obviously, and very dynamic, and just managed to.
And sociopathic.
And sociopathic. Well, they usually go hand in hand, unfortunately. Certainty of purpose, should we say?
Yeah.
And he had an idea that the thing that raised cholesterol in your bloodstream, which we don't have, was eating too much cholesterol. And that was his original hypothesis. And then he did experiments where he fed cholesterol to people, mainly in the form of egg yolks, and found it made no difference whatsoever to the thing that he measured in the blood that he called cholesterol. And so he decided, well, that can't be right, because it must be something else. And he just said, oh, well, it's probably saturated fat. I understand that was because somebody that he knew is in Italy, and post Second World War, there was a lot of rationing, very little meat was eaten, and the Italians had a low rate of heart disease.
Yeah.
So he immediately thought, oh, that's the answer. So he went off, distorted statistics from countries around the world to prove his case.
Yeah. And
convinced everybody that saturated fat, whatever he called them, raised cholesterol, whatever that was, that caused heart disease. And that idea became, if you like, the central idea that remains today, as strong as it ever was, really.
And it's easy, isn't it? You know, when you look at the bottom of the frying pan, you can see the congealed fat. And you can just imagine how that congealed fat in your artery will block the artery and cause a heart attack, right? I mean, it's in that sense, it's a very easy story to portray.
Absolutely. I mean, I think humans are suckers for a good story.
Mm.
In fact, I think we are overwhelmed when we get someone can tell a good story that we go, that I like that story. It makes sense to me, and I can see it. I can visualize it. And you're right. Even though cholesterol is not fat and fat is not cholesterol, and the two things are very loosely correlated substances, but the type of food that contains saturated fat tends to be animal, and it tends to look a bit gooey, and people don't like looking at fatty things particularly.
Yeah.
And then someone says, well, that's the same fatty stuff that ends up in your arteries. It's like, well, it's a simple idea.
Yeah.
Because
intuitively it makes sense. It's just devoid of any science.
Yeah, well, there is no science of any part of this. It's just lacking in science. And once you start looking into what happens to fats when you eat them, it all just disintegrates very rapidly as an idea. I mean, your fat is just transported directly from your gut straight into your fat cells without having anything to do with the liver, without having anything to do with the substance that we call bad cholesterol, which is low density lipoprotein. The two things are just unconnected.
Yeah.
And yet, in fact, the only thing that will make the fatty levels of fatty stuff in your blood go up for sure, and they've known this for years, is eating carbohydrates. And people say, well, how can eating carbohydrates make your level of fatty things in your blood go up? I said, because your liver converts carbohydrate into fat when it can't do anything else with it. When I often say to people, why do you think cows have got so much fat in them? They don't eat any fat at all, do they? They eat pure carbohydrates, grass. And what they do in their stomachs is they convert the carbohydrates into fatty acids. So in fact, cows actually eat an almost pure fat diet in reality. That's what they do, and yet they don't get heart disease. Yet they're full of fat. When we eat them full of saturated fat, we're told that's the thing that causes our fat levels in our blood to rise and we get heart disease. I mean, as you say, the level of scientific thinking here is zero.
And what's extraordinary is that all of us health professionals, including myself for a larger part of my career, knowing the science that I know, accepted this unquestioningly because it's handed down to you like gravity on a plate, and why would anyone argue it? So we're not going to make the mistake of confusing the technology and talk about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, but I do want to talk about lipids and transport mechanisms, because they are part of the story, I think. So let's kind of discuss this. So I always talk about the liver as a kind of metabolic factory. It produces stuff that it's the kind of factory, metabolic factory of the body. And the stuff it produces is oily. And as you said, the bloodstream is watery. And we know that water and oil don't mix. So you have to find some mechanism to get the oily stuff from the liver in the watery environment of the bloodstream to wherever it needs to go. And those things are called lipoproteins. So let's just have some conversation around that, because I do think as the plot and the clot thicken, it has a role to play.
Yeah, well, as you say, fats and cholesterol, two different substances, are transported. When you absorb them from your gut, they have to get from the gut to the liver or elsewhere. And they tend to go from the gut into the straight into the bloodstream. So they're transported in a particularly big form of lipoprotein. Confusingly, everything's called a different thing. So a very, very big lipoprotein is called a chylomicron. Just why? I suppose somebody called it that in 1832, and the name is stuck ever since. And
it's a particular lipoprotein.
A particular lipoprotein, about the size of, say, a basketball. And this, so the fats and cholesterol that are absorbed from your bloodstream, absorbed from your gut, go straight into your bloodstream, travel around your body. The chylomicron loses its fats, and it's mainly its fats, and then shrinks and shrinks and shrinks down until it becomes the size of about a tennis ball, at which point it's absorbed into the liver and sort of broken down. So that's the main route, and that's the route that avoids the liver, if you like, because the liver doesn't have to do anything to cholesterol or fats. It has no role in doing anything to them. It's quite happy for the rest of the body to get its resource straight from the gut. But if you eat carbohydrates, on the other hand, they've turned all carbohydrates, which is, as you know, bread, rice, pasta, Rice Krispies, anything that's cardboard boxes, or Rice Krispies, much the same thing, is that they are digested, broken down into simple sugars, mainly glucose and fructose, and then they go straight from the gut into the liver, because the body can't allow an enormous rise in the level of these sugars straight into the bloodstream, or else it would cause havoc. So they're transported directly to the liver. The liver then says, okay, what am I going to do with them? It can store about 500 calories worth. It allows a certain amount into the bloodstream gradually, and then cells can take that up if they want and store it themselves. You can store about 1,500 calories of carbohydrate, which is about 4 Mars bars or something, and after that you're full.
And it's a mixture of in the liver and in the muscles.
It depends how big your Mars bars are, how big the person is,
and how big your muscles are.
That's right. So a 6'6" powerlifting Icelandic would store a bit more than a 4'10" small petite woman, obviously, but on the basis that we can store a certain amount. So once you've stored that certain amount, the liver has to go, right, the only thing I can do now is make it into fats, and that's what it does. So it converts glucose, essentially. Fructose goes to glucose, glucose goes to fats, or what they call fatty acids. And these are packed into another form of a lipoprotein called a very low density lipoprotein, otherwise called a triglyceride. That then comes out of the liver and transports the excess fats around the body. So these VLDLs, or very low density lipoproteins, or chylomicrons, lose their fats as they travel around the body. They shrink down in size as they do that, and they become a low density lipoprotein, the thing that people call bad cholesterol, although it's not cholesterol. And at which point the liver removes virtually all of these from the bloodstream. So it's the liver that removes them. An interesting fact I was told a couple of years ago is people who have a thing called familiar hypercholesterolemia, where they've got millions of LDL molecules, and some people have got extraordinarily high levels, which is damaging, because you're talking about levels of 50 or 60, which is 20 or 30 times what the normal level should be. If these people get a liver transplant, their LDL, their level, their lipoprotein level, the bad cholesterol level, goes back to normal like that. So it's the liver that controls these levels of everything. It is the master controller and it makes sure that everything is done properly. So just to say again, the chylomicron, the big lipoprotein, takes fats from the gut, distributes them around the body. Little remnants are left to absorb back into the liver. If you eat carbohydrates and you have nowhere left to store them, the liver makes them turns them into fat, puts them into a VLDL. That transports them around the body, losing fat until it shrinks down into a low density lipoprotein. And that is then removed from the circulation generally. And it's that one that everyone says is the bad one. I don't know if you want me to talk at all or say what the thing that we call good cholesterol is.
Well, this is complicated stuff, isn't it? Because you've got this stuff being transported around the body in lipoproteins. And the way that I imagine it, and I don't know if it's helpful, I kind of describe it in two ways. One is if you imagine that you've got submarines and they dock at the liver, they take on the cargo, and depending on, they take on specific cargo and they go round the body, drop it off and come back to the liver and they're recycled. The other way I kind of imagine it is of a balloon. So you fill the balloon with whatever the contents might be, and as it goes round, the balloon becomes emptier and emptier and emptier, discharges its cargo, it then comes back to the liver, it's completely recycled, and off it goes again. So it's just a kind of way for people to imagine this without it becoming too scientific.
Yeah, I think the balloon's probably better because submarines don't get bigger and smaller, but
exactly.
So you can see your problem with it. Analogies always only work so far, but yeah, I mean, it is essentially it's a cargo vessel, but in this case, the cargo vessel gets bigger and then gets smaller. It picks up its load, gets rid of it, comes back again. That's what their function is. Yeah, is to take these things that can't be dissolved in water and allow them to be transported around the body to where they're needed. That's why they exist.
If you enjoyed the podcast and want to find out more, please join our Facebook group and don't forget to subscribe and follow so you don't miss the next episode. Maybe share as well to friends and family who might also benefit. And if you think you need some help with diabetes, pre-diabetes, hypertension, or reducing risk of stroke and heart disease, then do book a free consultation with me. There's absolutely no charge for this. You can ask lots of questions and we will never put you under any pressure. What do you have to lose? Thanks and bye for now.